Well, that's just the cover page of the Journal of John Banks. John Banks was born in 1638, and he was convinced at age 16. I'm sorry. He's from. He was born in Cumberland, and well, I'll go a little further right here. I thought I was just going to uh, thinking about what Ben said at the very beginning about how friends are today and friends back at the beginning were so different. Um, I had just gone through my tree and was looking for members of the family who had suffered during the persecutions of early friends. So all the people on the screen that are in orange boxes were people who either were imprisoned, were distrained, fined, or something else happened to them. And they're all except for one of them is recorded in Bess's sufferings. The one who isn't is Francis Warner, who I found in some of these the sessions of Essex records there. And I believe he was a friend. I can't be completely 100%. All his children were friends, so I believe he was as well. But anyway, and then the two in pink over here, I'm pretty sure that Anne King, under the name of Anne Stevens, was one of the handmaids of the Lord who signed the petition to Parliament in 1659 for Buckinghamshire, and I believe Anne Harris signed signed for Oxfordshire, but I'm speculating on her because the name is so common that it might not have been her. But anyway, so I figured I had nine of my either these are my eighth great grandparents, these are my seventh, and this one is a sixth. So eight or nine of these actually suffered during the persecutions in the first 40 years or so of Friends. And then we were talking about ancestors who met George Fox. So John Banks, whose journal I showed at the beginning, was one who had probably the closest contact with George Fox. He is technically one of the valiant 60, although he was not of the. He was convinced at age 16, but he didn't go into the ministry until he was until 1660. So he would have been in his mid-20s when he went there. He was from. He's often known as John Banks of Brigham, though he was born in Issel. No, I'm sorry, he was born in Sunderland, near Issel, in just north of Cockermouth. And I think his parents had an intention of putting him to the ministry because they sent him to school, even though they were very poor. They were fellmongers. The father was a fellmonger, and they were very poor, but he actually learned Latin, and he went at age 14. He was given a position at Mosser Chapel, which is a chapel of ease near Parchaw, which was under the church at Brigham. And he would read the scriptures on Sunday and read the homily at that time. And it was during that time that he became disenchanted with the religious, the standard religion that that was being practiced there. And the minister for Brigham Church, who oversaw Mosser Chapel, was John Wilkinson, who is referred to in Fox's journal. This is not the John Wilkinson of the Wilkinson story controversy, but he was the minister who debated Fox and saw most of his congregation go over to the Friends. And eventually, John Wilkinson himself became convinced and John Banks and John Wilkinson went on in ministry together, I think into Yorkshire and things like that. So I found one thing, which there isn't much mention of George Fox in John Banks's journal, and there is no mention of John Banks in George Fox's journal, but there is one passage in John Banks's journal, which I think is fairly interesting, and it's one that when Thomas Elwood edited Fox's journal, a lot of these types of stories were eliminated from Fox's journal because they were considered to be miracle stories, and there was a concern that it might make people consider Fox on the same level, or that friends were elevating Fox to the same level as Jesus. But this is a passage from Banks's journal. About this time, a pain struck into my shoulder and gradually fell down into my arm and hand, so that the use thereof I was wholly deprived of. And not only so, but my pain greatly increased both day and night. And for 3 months I could neither put my clothes on nor off myself. And my arm and hand began to wither, so that I did seek to some physicians for a cure, but no cure could get by any of them, until at last, as I was asleep upon my bed in the night time, I saw a vision that I was with dear George Fox. And I thought I said unto him, George, my faith is such that if thou seest it thy way to lay thy hand upon my shoulder, my arm and hand shall be whole throughout, which remained with me after I awaked 2 days and nights, that the thing was a true vision, and that I must go to GF until at last, through much exercise of mind, as a great trial of my faith, I was made willing to go to him, he being then at Swarthmore in Lancashire, where there was a meeting of friends, being on the first day of the week. And some time after the meeting, I called him aside into the hall and gave him a relation of my concern as aforesaid, showing him my arm and hand. And in a little time, we walking together silent, he turned about and looked upon me, lifting up his hand and laid it upon my shoulder, and said, the Lord strengthen thee both within and without. And so we parted, and I went to Thomas Lowers of Marsh Grange that night. And when I was sate down to supper in his house, immediately before I was aware, my hand was lifted up to do its office, which it would not do for so long as aforesaid, which struck me into great admiration, and my heart was broken into tenderness before the Lord. And the next day I went home with my arm and my hand and arm restored to its former use and strength, without any pain. And the next time that George Fox and I met in a little time, he said, John, thou mended? I answered, yes, very well, in a little time. Well, said he, give God the glory, to whom I was and still am bound in duty so to do. So this was in 1676, it's the kinds of miracles that supposedly Fox did do, and some friends tried to do and failed to do as well. I think Francis Haugill tried to make a lame man walk, but was not successful. But it was the type of miracles that were not uncommon with Fox and some friends, but that were considered at the time of Fox's journal being edited as being a little delicate to refer to. So besides John Banks's daughters Sarah and Anne were servants in the home of William Mead and Sarah Fell, daughter of Margaret Fell, at Havering near London, which is now, I guess, in London, but it was near London then. Sarah, my sixth great-grandmother, who later married John Warner of Waltham Abbey, entered service in 1682, and likely met and served George Fox and Margaret Fell during their visits to the Mead home. Anne Banks, as Anne Scotton, her married name, later became a public friend, and she lived in Coventry. So there were a few other early friends that also met George Fox in person. Jeremiah Stevens, who I share with John Stevens as a common ancestor, also my seventh great-grandfather, was originally an alderman at High Wycombe, and was convinced in the early 1650s. And in the short journal and itinerary journals of George Fox, the record is indicated that George Fox stayed at his home on the 10th of January, 1677-78, after he held a private meeting with John Raunce and Charles Harris of High Wycombe, who were opposed to the establishment of the women's meeting and would eventually split off from friends. It was also at Jeremiah Stevens' home that Thomas Elwood was first convinced after hearing Edward Burrows speak. And he did, he first met the Penningtons, but as a result of meeting the Penningtons, he went to hear Edward Burrows speak, and that's when he had his actual convincement, I guess. Another family member who met George Fox was Joseph Harris of Sibford Ferris. I share Joseph Harris with John Stevens and Michael Hargrave as a common ancestor. And he too is recorded in the short journal and itinerary journals of George Fox as having been the host of George Fox on the 30th and the 31st of March, 1678. And it's part of his property. Joseph Harris' property is now part of Sibford School. And during the same visit, or during the same round, George Fox also stayed with Edward Vivers of Banbury, whose wife, Mary, who was my eighth great-grandmother, though she was dead by the time that George Fox got around to visiting her house. But she was the mother of my seventh great-grandmother, Anne Hill, who was married to John Long of Nathrop near Banbury. And they possibly may have met George Fox while he was there. So then, and again, you cut me off when you want, but looking at the sufferings and the different family members who suffered under the persecutions, there are quite a few different examples of the kinds of suffering. One of the interesting ones is John Banks in 1662 was arrested at How Hill near Calbeck in Cumberland by the Justice of the Peace, George Fletcher of Hutton Hall, who whipped him and dragged him by his hair down the hill when he knelt before his horse in prayer. This was during a raid at a meeting where they were trying to disrupt the meeting. He was imprisoned at Carlisle jail and fined, and he refused to pay. As a result, his father, William Banks, had a cow and a horse seized from him. John Banks was released, and then because he refused to pay the jailer for his upkeep, he was sentenced back into jail. He traveled to Ireland a lot. He made 6 trips in the ministry to Ireland, and in 1671 he was arrested at Wicklow for holding illegal Friends meetings, but he was released because they wanted him to stop preaching in the jail, so they let him go. And the last one in 1684, he was imprisoned in Carlisle for refusing to pay tithes and refusing to take the oath of allegiance, and he was imprisoned for 6 years and 9 months at that time, and only released as a result of the Act of Toleration. And the other ancestors that I had that I showed earlier. There are a number of examples, and I won't go into them unless people want me to, but I'll just pick a few of them out. Robert Kingham, who I share also with John Stevens, at sessions in January of 1660, he was sent to prison for the same cause of refusing to take the oath of allegiance. Robert Kingham, Robert Wapshot, and Thomas Dell, who were apprehended passing through Maidenhead to visit their friends in prison at Reading. Josiah Lane was arrested quite a few times, mainly for not paying tithes. Jeremiah Stevens, who I mentioned earlier, who had known George Fox, was arrested for attending meeting, and he was also arrested in 1665 in participating in a funeral procession, and he was arrested and sent to Aylesbury jail, along with Isaac Pennington and Thomas Elwood, who were members of the same meeting. And as I mentioned, Anne Stevens, née Kingham, was one of the handmaids of the Lord in Buckinghamshire in 1659. John Long, who was a Banbury friend and was for a while the clerk, not the clerk, but the recording clerk of Banbury Quarter, was arrested numerous times and had his property distrained, as it's mentioned here, and spent a number of months and weeks in prison, but no long ones. But he was, I found it was interesting, he was in 1683, he was sentenced and charged for non-payment, in which he was pronounced contumacious. And I looked at contumacious. That means he was just like a troublemaker, and he just never stopped learning. He never learned the lesson from the first time. So eventually he got a certificate of contumacy. I'm sure how to pronounce that. And was imprisoned as a result of that. And then John Gum from Reading. This was a sort of a illustrative of how brutal some of the persecution could be. He, along with 13 friends, were stopped. There was a plan to raid the meeting, but they had all left the meeting, were returning home, and on the way home, John Gum and 13 or 12 others were arrested, and because they refused to tender the oath of allegiance, they were sent to prison, and they were confined in 2 small rooms over the dungeon, in which a felon lay sick of the smallpox. They were kept close, locked up 17 hours of 24, and not suffered to go out to ease themselves. And so here they are. They're being put at physical risk of, any of them could have caught the smallpox from the felon that was in there. So it was a pretty dangerous situation they had. Robert Raymond of Chatteris Meeting in Cambridgeshire was imprisoned for failing to attend the church, regular church service. Francis Warner. Now, this is the one I couldn't find a record in Bess, but I did find in the sessions rolls of Essex in 1666. Francis Warner of Chipping Unger, a hatter, spoke there these scandalous and seditious words of the Blessed Sacrament of our Lord, viz., that if he received the sacrament, he would drink a full cup to his brother Christ. And I think that offended some of the local people, and but I'm not sure whatever came of this. I suspect something did, but I'm not quite sure what it was. So that is what I've got.
Thank you, Christopher. I find myself sort of reeling in admiration at the courage and the temerity of these people. You know, you gotta be proud of having ancestors like that, haven't you?
Well, I suspect if we all look at our ancestors, we'll probably find a lot of them that were similar, in those three generations that face the same kinds of persecution. And yes, and do we friends today face that kind of, are we willing to face that kind of persecution today?